when we celebrated our first Thanksgiving in 1621, October. Lasted 3 days with Chief Massasoit and his warriors. And we even made a peace treaty with the Indians at that time. And thankfully we can continue to live in peace with them. I want to read to you from my journal that I compiled. This is just excerpts, and it's the history of Plymouth Plantation, covering the years 1620 to 1647. So I'm going to read some highlights to you of the journal that I compiled over the years. First, I will unfold the causes that led to the foundation of the new Plymouth settlement and the motives of those concerned in it, in order that I may give an accurate account of the project. I must begin at the very root and rise of it. In England, the Pilgrims were hunted and persecuted on every side. Some were clapped into prison. Others had their houses watched night and day and escaped with difficulty. And most were obliged to fly and leave their homes and means of livelihood. Yet, these and many other, even severer trials, which afterwards befell them, being only what they expected, they were able to bear by the assistance of God's grace and Spirit. However, being thus molested, and seeing there was no hope of their remaining there, they resolved by consent to go into the Low Countries, where they heard there was freedom of religion for all. And it was said that many from London and other parts of the country who had been exiled and persecuted for the same cause had gone to live at Amsterdam and elsewhere in the Netherlands. Seeing they could no longer continue under such circumstances, they resolved to get over to Holland as soon as they could, which was in the years 1607 and 08. For these reformers to be thus constrained to leave their native soil, their lands and living, and all their friends, was a great sacrifice, and was wondered at by many. But to go into a country unknown to them, where they must learn a new language, and get their livings they knew not how, seemed an almost desperate adventure in misery worse than death. Further, they were unacquainted with trade, which is the chief industry of their adopted country, having been used only to a plain country life and the innocent pursuit of farming. But these things did not dismay them, though they sometimes troubled them, for their desires were set on the ways of God to enjoy His ordinances. They rested upon His providence and knew of whom they had believed. But this was not all. For though it was made intolerable for them to stay, they were not allowed to go. The ports were shut up against them, so that they had to seek secret means of conveyance, to bribe the captains of ships and give extraordinary rates for their passages. Often they were betrayed, their goods intercepted, and thereby were put to great trouble and expense. I must not omit, however, to mention the fruit of it all. For by these public afflictions their cause became famous, and led many to inquire into it, and their Christian behavior left a deep impression on the minds of many. Some few shrank from these first conflicts, and no wonder, but many more came forward with fresh courage and animated the rest. In the end, notwithstanding the storms of opposition, they got over, some from one place, some from another, and met together again with no small rejoicing. After they had lived in Holland for some 11 or 12 years, experience having taught them much, their prudent governors began to apprehend present dangers and to scan the future and think of a timely remedy. They began at length to incline to the idea of removal to some other place, not out of any newfangled,ness, which often influences people to their detriment and danger, but for many important reasons, the chief of which I will here briefly touch upon. First, they saw by experience that the hardships of the country were such that comparatively few others would join them, and fewer still would bind it out and remain with them. Secondly, they saw that though the people generally bore these difficulties very cheerfully, they were with resolute courage, being in the best strength of their years, yet old age began to steal on many of them, and their great and continual labors, with other crosses and sorrows, hastened it before their time. Thirdly, still more lamentable, and of all the sorrows most heavy to be borne, was that many of the children, influenced by the oppressive conditions and the great licentiousness of the young people of the country, and the many temptations of the city, were led by evil example into dangerous courses, getting the reins off their necks and leaving their parents. Some became soldiers, others embarked upon voyages by sea, and others upon worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and the danger of their souls, to the great grief of the parents and dishonor of God. So they saw their posterity would be in danger to degenerate and become corrupt. Last, and not least, they cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. And though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work, the place they fixed their thoughts upon was somewhere in these vast and unpeopled countries of America, which were fruitful and fit for habitation, though devoid of all civilized inhabitants and given over to savages, who range up and down, differing little from the wild beasts themselves. This proposition, when made public, found many different opinions and raised many fears and doubts. They argued that it was so big an undertaking that it was open to inconceivable perils and dangers. Besides the casualties of the sea, they asserted that the length of the voyage was such that the women and other weak persons, worn out with age and travail, could never survive it. Even if they should, they contended that the miseries which they would be exposed to in such a country would be too hard to endure. They would be liable to famine, nakedness, and want. The change of air, diet, and water would infect them with sickness and disease. Again, all those who surmounted these difficulties would remain in continual danger from the savages, who are cruel, barbarous, and treacherous, furious in their rage, and merciless when they get the upper hand. Not content to kill, they delight in tormenting people in the most bloody manner possible, flaying some alive with the shells of fishes, cutting off the members and joints of others piecemeal, broiling them on the coals, and eating collops of their flesh in their sight while they still lived, with other cruelties too horrible to be related. It was replied that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be both met and overcome with answerable courage. It was granted the dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible. For many of the things feared might never befall. Others, by provident care and the use of good means, might in a great measure be prevented. And all of them, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be borne or overcome. True, it was that such attempts were not to be undertaken without good ground and reason, rashly or lightly, or as many had done, for curiosity or hope of gain. But their condition was not ordinary. Their ends were good and honorable, their calling lawful and urgent. Therefore they might expect the blessings of God on their proceedings. Yea, though they should lose their lives in this action, yet might they have the comfort of knowing that their endeavor was worthy. After many other things had been alleged on both sides, it was fully decided by the majority to undertake the enterprise and to prosecute it by the best means they could. The time having come when they must depart from Leyden, so they left that good and pleasant city, which had been their resting place for 12 years. But they knew they were pilgrims, and lifted up their eyes to heaven, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. But the tide which stays no man called them away. Though loth to part, and their reverent pastor, falling down on his knees, and all with him with heavy watery cheeks, commenced them with most fervent prayers to the Lord in his blessing. Then with mutual embraces and many tears, they took their leave of one another, which proved to be the last leave for many of them. The Mayflower sailed from Plymouth, England. It arrived in Cape Cod. The dates were September through November 1620. The Mayflower ship had never carried passengers before. It was strictly a cargo ship. She was a freighter, rather old and tired after more than 14 years of running taffeta and satins from Hamburg, hats and hemp to Norway, wine and cognac from France. Thanks to the wine, she was called a sweet ship. Her hold full of pleasant odors in contrast to the foul fumes that rose from similar ships of the day. Otherwise, she was no different from hundreds of other square riggers in this bustling section of the London port. Interesting facts. The ship was 90 feet long and 26 feet wide. Not made to carry passengers. It was so overcrowded because she took on passengers from the leaky Speedwell. Didn't have enough sleeping space. So they had started off with 2 ships, but the Speedwell was leaking, so it had to go back to shore. They all had to get into one ship. There were 134 on board. Master Christopher Jones and his crew of 30 sailors, 102 passengers comprised of saints and strangers. Now the saints were the pilgrims. The strangers were people that weren't the pilgrims. Some were perhaps Christians and members of the Anglican Church, but they weren't pilgrims. 34 were children. The remainder were strangers, men going to the New World for adventure, or because they couldn't find work in England. There was 1 doctor, 1 soldier, 1 shoemaker, 1 blacksmith, and 1 cooper on board. Most were farmers, shopkeepers, and weavers. There was 1 baby who was born on board at sea, named Oceanus Hopkins. Materials, furniture and household furnishings were on the ship. Books, animals, guns and armor, tools, building supplies, food for a 2-month journey plus food for the New World, cask of beer, wine and water, seeds for planting the new crop. It set sail on September the 6th, 1620, and arrived in Cape Cod on November 9th, 1620. The ship returned, the Mayflower, on April 5th, 1621. None of the pilgrims came back home.
Amen. No looking back.
It was a dangerous voyage. for one small ship to sail the Atlantic alone. This was unusual. The main beam cracked in an Atlantic Ocean storm. A large screw which the Pilgrims had brought was used to keep the beam in place. One man swept off the deck in a storm, but he was saved. Well, these troubles of the voyage being over, and all being together in one ship, they put to sea again on September 6th with a prosperous wind. This is after the troubles of the Speedwell, which continued for several days, and some encouragement to them. Though, as usual, many were afflicted with seasickness. I must not omit to mention here a special example of God's providence. There was an insolent and very profane young man, one of the sailors, which made him the more overbearing, who was always harassing poor people in their sickness, and cursing them daily, and with grievous curses, and not hesitant to tell them that he hoped to throw half of them overboard before they came to their journey's end. If he were gently reproved by anyone, he would curse and swear most bitterly. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite the young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first to be thrown overboard. Thus his curses fell upon his own head, which astonished all of his mates, for they saw it was the just hand of God upon him. But to be brief, after long beating at sea, on November 9th, they fell with a part of the land called Cape Cod, at which they were not a little joyful. Having found a good haven, and being brought safely in the sight of land, they fell upon their knees, and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and purest ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries of it, again to set their feet upon the firm and stable earth, their proper element. But here, I cannot but make a pause, and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so I think will reader too, when he considers it well, having thus passed the vast ocean and that sea of troubles, before while they were making their preparation, they now had no friends to welcome them, no inns to entertain and refresh their weather-beaten bodies, nor houses, much less towns, to repair to. And of course, no pizza. It is recorded in Scriptures, Acts 28, as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked crew, that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians, when they met with them, as will appear, were readier to fill their side full of arrows than otherwise. As for the season, it was winter, and those who have experienced the winters of the country know them to be sharp and severe, and subject to fierce storms, when it is dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men, and what multitude there might be of them they knew not, for which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to heavens. They could gain little solace from any outward objects. Summer being done, all things turned upon them a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets presented a wild and savage view. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now a gulf separating them from all civilized parts of the world. What then could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? Ought not the children of their fathers rightly say, "Our fathers were Englishmen, who came over the great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked upon their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because He is good, vanquish their enemies, and give them deliverance. Afterwards they gave God solemn thanks and praise for their deliverance. They called the place the First Encounter. I will turn back a little to November 11th, 1620, and begin with a compact or deed drawn up by them before they went ashore to settle, constituting the first foundation of their government. This was occasioned partly by the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers among them had let fall, that when they got ashore they would use their liberty, and none had power to command them. The form of the deed was as follows. And of course, this deed is known as the Mayflower Compact. It starts off by saying, in the name of God, amen, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic. So this is the forerunner to our Constitution. How does the preamble of the Constitution start? What words? Who remembers?
We the people.
We the people. What do they say? We whose names are underwritten. So they had this idea of self-government. And this is a wonderful foundation that the Pilgrims gave us with the Mayflower Compact. But soon a most lamentable blow fell upon them. In 2 or 3 months' time, half the company died, partly owing to the severity of the winter, especially during January and February, and want of houses and other comforts, partly scurvy and other diseases, which their long voyage and their incommodious quarters had brought upon them. All of the 100 odd persons, scarcely 50 remained, and sometimes 2 or 3 persons died in a day. In the time of worst distresses, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons who, to their great commendation, be it spoken, spared no pains night or day, but with great toil, and at the risk of their own health, fetched wood, made fires, prepared food for the sick, made their beds, washed their infected clothes, dressed and undressed them, in a word, did all the homely and necessary services for them, which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear mentioned. And all this they did willingly and cheerfully, without the least grudging, showing their love to the friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of these were Mr. William Brewster, their reverend elder or pastor, and Mr. Miles Standish, their captain and military commander, to whom myself and many others were much beholden in our low and sick condition. And yet the Lord so upheld these men that in this general calamity they were not at all affected with sickness. And what have I said of these few? I should say of many others who died in this general visitation, and others yet living, that while they had health or strength, they forsook none that had need of them. I doubt not that their recompense is with the Lord. But amongst the sailors, there was quite a different bearing in their misery. Those who before, in the time of their health and welfare, had been boon companions in drinking and partying, began now to desert one another, saying they would not risk their lives for the sick among them, lest they should be infected by coming to help them in their cabins. If they died, let them die. But the passengers who were still aboard showed them what pity they could, which made some of their hearts relent, such as the boatswain, who was an overbearing young man, and before would often curse and scoff at the passengers. But when he grew weak, they had compassion on him and helped him. Then he confessed he did not deserve it at their hands, for he had abused them in word and deed. Oh, said he, you, I see now, show your love like Christians indeed to one another, but we let one another die like dogs. All this while, the Indians came stalking about. Those who were ashore and would sometimes show themselves aloof at a distance, but when they approached them, they would run away. After the 16th of March, a certain Indian came boldly among them and spoke to them in broken English, which they could well understand. But they were astonished at it. At length they understood by speaking with him that he was not of these parts, but belonged to the eastern country, where some English ships came to fish. And with some of these English he was acquainted, and could name several of them. From them he had gotten his knowledge of the language. He became useful to them, and acquainted them with many things concerning the state of the country. His name was Samoset. He told them also of an Indian whose name was Squanto, a native of their part, who had been in England and could speak English better than himself. After some time of entertainment, being dismissed with gifts, in a little while he returned with 5 more, and they brought back all the tools that had been stolen, and made way for the coming of their great chief, called Massasoit, who about 4 or 5 days after came with the chief of his friends and other attendants, and with Squanto. Within him, after friendly entertainment and some gifts, they made peace, which has now continued for 24 years. Actually, it continued another quarter of a century after that. For over 50 years, there was peace between the Pilgrims and the Indians. Squanto stayed with them. He was their interpreter and became a special instrument sent from God for their good, beyond their expectation. The settlers, as many as were able, then began to plant their corn, in which service Squanto stood them in good stead, showing them how to plant it and cultivate it. He also told them that unless they got fish to manure this exhausted soil, it would come to nothing. And he showed them that in the middle of April, plenty of fish would come up the brook by which they had begun to build, and taught them how to catch it and where to get other necessary provisions, all of which they found true by experience. In 1622, Squanto fell ill with the Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians took for a symptom of death, and within a few days he died. He begged the governor to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and bequeathed several of his things to some of his English friends as remembrances. His death was a great loss. In 1623, they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop than they had done, so that they might not continue to endure the misery of want. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the advice of the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household, and to trust to themselves for that, in all other things to go on in the general way as before. So every family was assigned a parcel of land, according to the proportion of their number, with that in view, for present purposes only, and making no division for inheritance, all boys and children being included under the same family. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor or any others could devise, and saved them a great deal of trouble, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field, and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. The failure of this experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years, and by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients, applauded by some later times, that the taking away of private property and the possession of it in community by a commonwealth would make a state happy and flourishing, as if it were wiser than God. For in this instance, community property, so far as it went, was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit and comfort. It was, if it was thought all were to share alike, and all were to do alike, then all were on an equality throughout, and one would be as good as another. And so, if it did not actually abolish these relations which God himself had set amongst men, it was at least greatly diminished the mutual respect that is so important should be preserved among them. Let none argue that this is due to human failing, rather than to the communistic plan of life itself. I answer, seeing that all men have this feeling in them, that God in his wisdom saw another plan of life was fitter for them. Harvest time had now come, and then instead of famine, God gave them plenty, and the face of things was changed to the rejoicing of the hearts of many, for which they blessed God. And the effect of their particular planning was well seen, for all had, one way or another, pretty well to bring the year about. And some of the abler sort and more industrious had to spare, and to sell to others. In fact, no general want or famine has been amongst them since to this day. Amen.